Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you virtually. Thank you so much for joining. I know it's late in the day and we're all, hopped up on Solarpunk, so we appreciate you being here. My name is Sanjana. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Earth Hacks and the co-lead of the Environmental Justice in Tech project, and I'm here with Camille. Give you a minute to say hi before I dive in.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for those wonderful introductions, Tyler. Yes, my name is Camille, and I am the Deputy Director of Earth Hacks, and we are excited to lead this session today. And yeah, we'll look forward to it, and we'll jump right in.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let me see if I can successfully share my screen.
Okay.
And take it away. Okay, cool. Well, I'll get us started. So today we're going to be talking about the notion of regenerative duality and kind of trying to balance light and dark in tech-driven environmental solutions. And so there's a lot of overlaps with Solarpunk, also with cyberpunk, and we would argue its cousin, lunarpunk, which we'll get a little bit more into. So to kind of set the stage, we want to tell you a little bit more about our work and how and why it kind of interfaces and fits in with the Solarpunk world. So we've already been introduced, so I'm going to skip this slide. But we come from Earth Hacks, which in a sentence is an environmental hackathon organization, and our mission is to harness hackathons as a form of climate action. We do this by partnering with students and organizations from all over the world to create hackathons that advance transformative environmental education and really change fundamentally how students see themselves in the environmental space, as well as developing very particular skills around specific subject matter, and also by pushing forward a constellation of small but meaningful environmental projects that really focus prototyping at service learning hackathons. And so kind of some of our core pillars are recognizing that hackathons have been around as part of the open source software movement, as part of the maker movement, more recently have gone kind of quote unquote mainstream in an effort to push computer science education. And so there are tons of them happening anyways. And so it's a missed opportunity for climate action and to kind of get people with a maker spirit into climate action. If we don't engage with hackathons, we really want to. It allows us to focus on students and really this peer-to-peer experiential learning. It's an opportunity for us to kind of try and shift the culture in tech spaces to primarily causing environmental problems to primarily trying to solve them. And it really is a really cool manifestation of people power and just kind of putting 100 people together over the course of a weekend and really seeing what they can generate. So some of our hackathons in the past have worked on everything from indigenous land relationships and environmental justice policy to marine mammal conservation, urban heat island mapping, and hardware creation for Amazon rainforest conservation. So we encourage you to check out some of the other work we've done at earthhacks.io so we don't spend the whole session talking about this, but happy to answer any questions about hackathons. And what we're doing here today is coming to you from our Environmental Justice and Technology program, which is a collection of resources that's dedicated to imagining the future of environmentally just technology. And here we take the notion of environmental justice from scholar Dr. Robert Bullard, who's commonly called the father of environmental justice, when he speaks about the distribution of environmental benefits and burdens and the right for equal environmental protection for everyone, regardless of what their socioeconomic background is. And so with environmental justice and technology, all of these phrases are very high level, right? When you talk about the environment, that could mean different things to different people. When you speak about justice, that could mean different things to different people. When you put the phrase environmental justice together, it means something very different to a person in the United States and a person in another part of the world, and then technology. So all of these things are really high level. We aim to keep them very high level so that we can account for kind of multiple ways of knowing and multiple perspectives. But in our practice, we generally use the most high level definition that allows us to connect with the most people, which is actually from the Encyclopedia Britannica, and says that technology is the application of scientific knowledge to the practical aims of human life, or as it's sometimes phrased, to the change and manipulation of the human environment. And so that phrase human environment really ties in very closely to our mission at Environmental Justice in Tech. And so we argue, through this project, and, I think that this has a lot of resonance with some of the themes that we've heard throughout the conference, is that we really need to carefully consider how and why we create the technology and the infrastructure for technology that we do, and actually who we is. Who gets to be a part of that decision-making and who gets to be a part of that implementation process. And so, we argue that there's a lot of evidence that tech can be very exclusive. Tech, how we conceive of it kind of in, popular narratives and popular media, people often think of big tech. There are questions of who has had access to quote unquote technical education. Are people who are really, really active in the maker movement who don't have any formal training, would we argue that they are in tech or are they out of tech? Who has access to education now, in light of kind of historical barriers that continue into the present day? Who's made to feel welcome in spaces? We very often have first-time hackers come to Earth Hacks events because it's the first time that they've felt safe and welcome ever at a place that uses the word hackathon. And who's made to feel excluded? How much human potential are we completely ignoring because we won't stand up to kind of some of the issues and discrimination in tech cultures? So these are really key questions when we consider, again, who gets to be a part of that tech movement and who gets to make decisions around how we create technology. And so an example of, what we argue happens when you overlook these questions is what happened with Cancer Alley. And so I know we're on Zoom, but I'd love to do a virtual show of hands. How many people have heard of Cancer Alley before? If you put an emoji in the chat or raise your hand with the Zoom feature or something. How many people have heard of Cancer Alley? All right, we've got 2. We've got a few. Okay, all right. So a couple of people here know about this. I'm very happy to see that. Not happy that it exists, but Cancer Alley is the really unfortunate nickname for this one stretch of land in southern Louisiana in the continental United States. And it's an 85-mile stretch of land that has around 200 petrochemical facilities sited there. And this region is an area where it's predominantly people who are suffering from poverty. It's predominantly a Black population, and it's predominantly a disenfranchised population in that they don't have a lot of political power with, issues in our voting situation in the United States. And so this begs the questions of how did Cancer Alley happen? Right? It didn't just appear overnight. Deliberate decisions were made to put those petrochemical facilities in that region. Who made that decision and why? What factors were they considering? Who designed those petrochemical plants? Were they the same people as the ones who sited them there? Who physically constructed them? Probably not the same groups of people. Who works there on site now and who works for the parent companies? So, by actually thinking about these questions, we might be able to get some insight into the underlying motivators, of how situations like Cancer Alley exist. This is an example of what's called a sacrifice zone, where, a small group of people are exposed to a lot of environmental pollution, a lot of environmental burden for kind of the quote unquote benefit of other populations further away. Cancer Alley is unfortunately one of thousands of sacrifice zones all over the world. So environmental justice and technology really seeks to grapple with how did we allow this technology to happen? How did we allow technology to enable sacrifice zones in the first place? And so kind of our 2 central theses of this framework that we're calling the environmental justice and technology framework is first, something that we just talked about, environmental injustice. It doesn't just happen. Sacrifice zones don't just appear. It's deliberately created and deliberately engineered. So the harm is somebody's making harmful decisions. And our second thesis is that environmental justice is not kind of like a nice to have tech for good add-on in engineering projects and science projects. It's actually a basic health and safety criterion, and it's completely essential when we consider how we build technology, especially as we think about solarpunk futures, right? And we think about kind of this notion of utopia. We want to be very careful with, who are we building the utopia for? So it really ties into kind of some of those core questions. And so there's a lot of juxtapositions and a lot of tension, that needs to be navigated to get us closer to a world where we have answers to these questions and where we have good answers to these questions. There's a lot of tension between our current approach to tech development writ large and environmental justice principles, which, if you aren't familiar, were created in the 90s, I think in Washington, D.C. by a group of people. And we'd highly encourage you to read them as they're, really visionary. There's something else that's been touched upon today, a lot of ethical dilemmas related to tech material sourcing, right? It's really fantastic that we are all here for this virtual conference, exchanging knowledge, exchanging ideas. I've learned so much, but it's very likely that the components for the computer that I'm using to connect to all of you came from areas that have slave labor and child labor. And that's a real issue that we have to contend with. And then there's this notion of, how do we align or how do we fundamentally redefine what we think of as tech innovation with justice so that we can both connect to each other, for virtual conferences and also do so with machines that were not created with a lot of human and environmental suffering. So we really think that there's a very urgent need to co-define what justice-centric approaches to tech development look like. And that means a really critical examination of how and why we develop tech, who we do it for, and this notion of who gets to be an innovator. What do we consider to be innovative, and whose ideas are considered to be innovative? And so thankfully, we're not starting from scratch. I know we've talked about Cancer Alley, we've talked about slave labor, but there are issues and there are, examples that we can look to for what direction we can go in. Speculative fiction, as we all know here at this conference, is one place. And in real life, some examples are, the notion of food justice and, agricultural technologies that have been in use by different cultures across the world for millennia really provide a wonderful example of what it looks like to feed people, to do it well, and to also not completely destroy the soil that you are using in the process. Another example is the notion of kind of energy justice projects. So, remote communities, traditional communities, indigenous communities, especially, are kind of taking their power into their own hands and are, installing community-led renewable energy projects, community-governed, community created energy projects that really provide wonderful precedent. And then there's this whole field, actually, of indigenous data leadership and data sovereignty that we can really look to think about what does it mean to have, multiple modes of information and of what we now call data, and do so in a way that actually makes sense and respects cultural norms of different groups of people. So there's thankfully a lot of different places that we can look to kind of try to think about what environmental justice in tech looks like. So we welcome you to take a look at our environmental justice and tech guiding principles. We're not going to read all of them because there's several of them, but just something to kind of chew upon and ponder upon a little bit. And we have kind of 3 as a nice little preview over here. So I'll keep this up for a second in case you want to scan the QR code or take down the URL or the bit.ly, but we will also share these materials afterwards, so you should have them. So now I'm going to turn it over to Camille, who can talk a little bit more about some of the direct ties between some of the ideas we've been talking about and solar, lunar, and cyberpunk methodologies.
Finding my way off of Zoom. Thank you for that, Sanjana. And we're going to need to do several clicks through because there's like an animated version of this. Yep. So yeah, as you just click through, it should lead you to like maybe 7 different steps. But yeah, for this work that we're talking through, from renewable energy systems and smart grids to precision agriculture and environmental monitoring, technology has opened up new frontiers in our quest for what we have collectively, for the most part, understood as sustainability. However, we must also reckon with what we understand as the dark side of digitalization, of technology, of innovation, and the environmental and social harms that, these technologies have wrought. The production, the use, and disposal of technological devices has contributed to resource depletion, e-waste accumulation, and a growing carbon footprint. And, we put an asterisk next to carbon footprint because, moving away from individual blame to corporate responsibility. And so the energy consumption of data centers and cryptocurrency has reached alarming levels and exacerbating the climate crisis that we all face disproportionately across the globe. Moreover, the toxic burden of e-waste has disproportionately affected marginalized communities, exposing them to hazardous chemicals and exploitative labor practices. Next slide, please. And so the harm of technological development extends far beyond the environmental realm. Biased algorithms and surveillance technologies have exacerbated social inequalities and perpetuated systemic injustices. So the digital divide that we know exists has left a lot of marginalized communities without access to the tools and skills needed to thrive in the digital age, especially those in previously colonized nations of the global South. I myself am born and raised in the Bahamas, a Caribbean island nation and coastal community. And so the gig economy as well has also eroded workers' rights and the well-being of individuals and communities, while the spread of misinformation and hate speech on social media has fueled polarization and undermined mental health across different gender, racial, and otherwise communities. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, we are here today to talk about the exciting realm of Solarpunk. And so we are in a very shared space and in a space where a lot of folks understand Solarpunk and what it means. Oftentimes in the work that we do, when we are presenting to technology companies and technologists, or even like young students in the tech education space, Solarpunk as a genre, as a movement, as an aesthetic is very unfamiliar. And so for us, we consider the Solarpunk possibility, which offers a utopian vision, right, of the world, where technology is designed for sustainability, repairability, and community empowerment. In this future that we love and strive for, renewable energy powers our cities. Circular economy principles guide our production and our consumption, and the voices of marginalized communities are centered in the development of new technologies. Solarpunk, originating again as a subgenre of speculative fiction, but growing into so much more, invites us to imagine a world where innovation is driven not by profit, but by a deep commitment to social and ecological well-being. Solarpunk also extends into the realms of urban planning and agriculture and technology. And as we strive to create eco-friendly urban environments and regenerative food systems in the face of climate change. Next slide, please. And so on the other hand, as we are perhaps more familiar with, and again, we are doing a lot of this just to level set, cyberpunk presents this dystopian warning of dangers unchecked and technological innovation and digital growth. And so in this bleak representation of the future, we have corporations who wield unchallenged power and widening socioeconomic disparities and eroding human rights and everything that we come to know and understand about what is presented to us as, dystopian cyberpunk. And so we experience environmental collapse and surveillance capitalism, which have rendered vulnerable communities even more vulnerable and expendable, while there's a loss of privacy and agency, which then becomes the norm. Cyberpunk as, an all-encompassing movement, as we are now presenting it as, or as we are positioning moving along, cautions us against this seductive allure of technological solutionism, right? That AI or renewable energy or whatever other technology that we imagine will be the silver bullet to all of the problems that we have. And it reminds us of the high stakes of our choices as scientists, technologists, developers, consumers, prosumers, and whatever else it may be as we position ourselves in society. Next slide, please. And so with this work, the most nuanced perspective comes from the lunarpunk movement, which we admit and know has adopted various interpretations, but at its root acknowledges the shadows and the complexities of the futures that we endure and strive towards. And so due to the various interpretations and its fluidity, we will spend just a bit more time level setting our understanding of lunarpunk in contrast to the other two, which we have assumed that folks are more familiar with. And so for the purposes of the session that we will then move into today, we as facilitators adopt a perspective of lunarpunk that asks the critical questions, which was posed by a group called Lunarpunk Anarchists. What happens in the solarpunk community when the sun goes down? In regards to technology and technological innovation, what happens to and within our solarpunk communities when this utopian, optimistic vision of the future that we hold so dear is challenged? As a subgenre of solarpunk, lunarpunk is meant to exist as, and I quote, an artistic, aesthetic, literature, and political movement founded on ecology, decentralization, non-hierarchy, mutual aid, individual liberty, liberatory technology, diversity, feminism, and the merging of art, science, and politics. Next slide, please. And so as facilitators in today's workshop, we push for a version of lunarpunk that is more of a focus on exploring the balance between strong communities and individual liberty, rather than simply thinking about individual liberty as some kind of opposite of community values, which lunarpunk has often, or what we've seen is familiarly been proposed. And so again, ultimately, lunarpunk recognizes that even the most well-intentioned innovations can be co-opted for nefarious purposes, and that the darker aspects of, darker in quotes, aspects of human nature must be reckoned with. It emphasizes the importance of critical reflection, adaptation, and community resilience in the face of uncertainty and change, and embraces the shadows, right, or the subtler forces in life, with an emphasis on community, again, introspection, emotional resilience in the face of this work. So next slide. We move then to our activity, which we call speculative visioning, critical visioning, where we want to embrace these familiar frameworks of solarpunk, cyberpunk, and lunarpunk, and engage in a process where we can speculatively vision the future of technology and the role that technology plays both in a solarpunk as well as a cyberpunk reality. And we position lunarpunk as the thought process that we will engage in as we move through the questions, through the imagining, through the visioning. And so in small groups, we'll have the opportunity, and I think we might be in small groups. I think we need to look at the number of participants, which if we can do one group, beautiful. If it's best to move into smaller groups, we will. But we'll have the opportunity to explore specific technologies through the lenses, again, of these genres, envisioning both the utopian possibilities and the dystopian risks that they present with the pragmatism that lunarpunk aims to put forward. And so with that being said, as we move forward in this exercise, we encourage you to consider the ethical implications of each technology and the interventions needed to steer us towards a more just and sustainable future and away from a future that presents this idea of doom and gloom, again, in regards specifically to technology. And so what would it take to develop and deploy these technologies in a way that prioritizes the needs of marginalized communities and the health of our planet? What unintended consequences might arise, and how might we mitigate them? These are just some of the questions that will be posed to us. And so we challenge you to remember that the power of this exercise lies not in finding definitive answers, but in the process of critical inquiry itself. And so by bringing together diverse perspectives and expertise, folks here come from, they run the gamut, right? And we all come into this space coming from different communities, from different professional backgrounds. And so we encourage you to bring that forward, to ask questions on behalf of the spaces that you yourself occupy. And so we challenge our assumptions, and we want to, spark new ideas or get them up to the surface and build the collaborative capacity needed to tackle the very complex challenges before us as we think about technology. At Earth Hacks and through the Environmental Justice and Tech Project, we believe strongly that, as we move into the future, everything becomes a problem, a challenge, or a possibility related to environmental justice in technology. And so that is what we will move into the session with. And I think, we can stop sharing and we will move from presentation mode into Miro. So I will close out on a few things.
Do you think that we want to split up or stick in one group? Oh, you're on mute.
I think looking at the numbers, I think it might be good to just split us up into groups. Hopefully that'll encourage some really good conversation and discussion around the topic at hand.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split us up into breakout rooms. We're going to go into our breakout rooms, 2 of them. One breakout room will be led by myself, the other by Camille. And then we'll come back when we have about 5 minutes or so left in the session, so we can do a little bit of a share out. So assuming I can get breakout rooms to work.
Yeah.
Let's see. So everyone should be able to join. I'm going to wait here a minute and make sure everyone is cool. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump into my room as well. See you soon.
All righty.
Cool. It looks like our group is back. Welcome.
Hello, hello.
If you have a moment to stick around, thank you so much for participating and for bearing with us while we navigated Miro. My group got to hear about my use of the phrase enshittification by Cory Doctorow, who's someone who's probably very familiar to this audience. And so we just experienced it. So we wanted to see if anyone wanted to share out anything for the session, as we found it's sometimes a really helpful reflective space for people to talk about their ideas. So just open invitation if you'd like to share anything about what you thought about, share any takeaways from your session. Now is also a time for questions, because I'm happy to stick around for the duration of the break to chat. So I'll go on mute, see if anyone has anything, and if not, we can wrap up. Oh, go ahead, Celie.
I'm just curious about so lunarpunk. I've know a little bit about it, but I do feel like you all presented a take on it that's a bit different than what I've encountered so far in relatively limited exposure compared to Solarpunk. I'm just curious about I guess how your framing is landing with the other people that you've been, presenting your concepts to so far, and if you might say anything a bit more about, I suppose, the sweet spot that you're wanting to get to vis-a-vis lunarpunk or whatever other descriptive terms.
I can take
You
that
want
one.
to take the, yeah.
Yeah. So Earth Hacks as an organization, again, and the Environmental Justice and Tech Project, we're often positioned uniquely when we enter into certain spaces. So as we engage with a lot of like the grassroots or communities or coalition spaces, we are oftentimes more or less the ones that are bringing this tech perspective, right? So we kind of stick out. Then with technology groups, we're the ones speaking about, Solarpunk and lunarpunk visions, environmental justice. This is what mutual aid. This is what this work has to contribute to. And so again, we find ourselves also sticking out. This is the first conference that we've been at where the theme, and everyone here is deeply familiar with what Solarpunk is. And so as we kind of mentioned in our presentation, for us, we've sort of looked at and examined different interpretations of lunarpunk, and we try to just sort of maintain this higher level positioning of, the shadow questioning, reflection, critical inquiry of what it means to imagine the futures of what tech means. For some people, it is very dystopian, right? We don't want AI to be so pervasive in the spaces that we do. There's no solution. It is all doom and gloom. And in other spaces, there's this idea and this notion and this belief of techno-solutionism that is the future. And so when we speak of lunarpunk, it is essentially to just think of, or to move from the sense of pragmatism. What happens when we have this ideal of what it is that we want the world to be, and we want the role of technology to play in? And how can we move to think about transparency and privacy as well as protection in moving forward? So I hope that was some insight, more or less, but it is also relatively new to us. And we know it takes many forms, which we definitely hope to and want to respect and not sort of muddy the waters as we speak about it.
Camille,
yes,
you wanted to touch up on the sacrificial zones another time, and I have something that's maybe relevant too, because I have experienced that tech can make you sometimes a bit blind in the best of circumstances, actually, in a way that you don't actually how do I say it that correctly? That you don't actually consider these disparities and just want to have an almost egalitarian approach to any situation. And how does that fit into the environmental justice department? Gonna mute myself now.
Could you possibly articulate that last question for me, please?
Okay, what I'm basically saying is that you can sometimes have a technological solution that is through the best of through the best of intentions, very blind to things like social differences and so on and so forth. And how do you work with tech solutions to make them aware of that and work out solutions with them without actually compromising the technical solutions for that problem.
Okay, so more or less, how do we, combat this idea of techno-solutionism and speak to the need for embedding justice into, technology as we engage with different practitioners? Yes?
Not really.
Okay.
Sorry. So
No, yeah.
you have a problem and you have a technical solution, and through every single best of intentions, the engineers and the technicians are absolutely oblivious to whatever social disparities might exist, whether that's marginalized communities, whether that's an environmentalism or something or other that is negatively affected by this solution. And how do you work with these engineers and the technicians to remedy these impacts without actually compromising or removing the technological solution to that problem?
So excuse me, I can jump in here. And I think that that's actually one of the fundamental questions we seek to answer with the Environmental Justice in Tech project. I think the first thing is challenging some of the assumptions. One is kind of the notion of what we consider a technical solution. I argue very often to our students that when applied in a real world context, there are no technical issues or social issues, there are socio-technical issues. Both are fundamental aspects of the issues that we face. But our current positioning of issues is that they're either social or technical. And so there's kind of some issues there. And when it comes to what we think of as kind of a solution to a problem, I would also kind of challenge the assumption that there's a singular, quote unquote, technical solution to an issue. If we have air pollution in a certain region, there are many different ways to combat it. The easiest being reducing the point source and then kind of figuring out what infrastructure, what other system kind of takes its place. So how we are trying to work with scientists and technologists to address issues, while not compromising the efficacy of whatever systems we put into place to, create, again, clean air quality, access to transit, access to energy, is really fundamentally challenging how we are trained as scientists and engineers. So I'm an electrical engineer. I worked as a hardware engineer for several years, and I was always stunned, for example, that we had no e-waste practices. And that, when we're kind of like doing a lot of these issues, or creating devices to deal with issues like air pollution, which is what I actually worked on, or urban heat, which is another thing that I built devices for, we didn't consider at all who was going to use the data from these devices. What are the timelines for reductions in air pollution in the areas that we were working? And so I actually stopped doing that work because I was like, this is ineffective. Air pollution has gotten worse since I became an engineer building air quality devices. We're not approaching this problem effectively. So I think that it actually starts with kind of really redefining how we see technical and non-technical challenges and thinking critically about what issue we need to solve and what tools we have at our disposal. So you can build a really great top of the line air quality monitor, but if you don't have a plan for where the data is going to go, what we're going to do once we have that data, who's going to be accountable, it's difficult to kind of see any sort of like reduction in air pollution, continuing to use that example. Is that helpful, and does that kind of answer your question?
Somewhat.
Okay.
I have to elaborate the entire thing into a scenario, basically.
If you don't mind continuing,
Yeah.
we have to move back to track A now for the rest of the day. This is the last one in B.
Totally.
Sorry, we just went way over, but I appreciate we all appreciate all of this discussion. It's great. There's also a Discord text channel for your questions and further discussion. So thank you so much.
Thanks all. Take care. See you
Thank
soon.
you all.
Bye.